Dear viewers, welcome to our channel. Subscribe to receive more stories every day. Jenna Thompson adjusted her coat, feeling the familiar chill of the courtroom seep into her bones. She hadn't stepped foot in a place like this since her parents' bitter divorce decades ago. And now, here she was, standing on the opposite side of fate, fighting for her own dignity. She glanced down at her trembling hands, the only thing she had left to cling to besides a single worn-out folder tucked under her arm. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. The whispers around her grew louder as the double doors swung open, revealing Greg Thompson strutting in with his legal entourage. The man who once vowed to cherish her now sauntered across the room like a king among peasants. He wore a smug smile as if today's proceedings were merely another business deal, a trivial task to crush and conquer. Behind him, his lawyer, Randall Markham, adjusted his tie with practiced precision. Markham was notorious for his courtroom victories, and Greg had spared no expense to make sure his win today was absolute. Jenna swallowed hard, her throat tight with a mix of fear and resentment. She wasn't here to beg or plead. She had moved past the tears weeks ago. No, today was different. She hadn't slept in days, running every scenario through her mind, her every move calculated like pieces on a chessboard. The judge called the court to order, and Jenna took her seat at the plaintiff's table, alone and unrepresented. Markham's laugh cut through the room, an arrogant sound meant to intimidate, but Jenna kept her gaze forward. Greg didn't even glance her way. Why would he? She was just the quiet, doting wife he had discarded like an outdated suit. Jenna's hands stopped trembling as she remembered why she was here. Not for revenge, but for justice. Greg had stolen more than just money. He had stolen years, dreams, and her very sense of self. But she wouldn't let him see her broken. The judge glanced at Jenna with a hint of pity. "Mrs. Thompson, are you representing yourself today?" "Yes, Your Honor," Jenna replied, her voice surprisingly steady. Markham barely contained his smirk. "Your Honor, if I may, I'd like to expedite proceedings given the lack of opposition. My client and Mrs. Thompson were married for 23 years, and as stipulated in the prenuptial agreement, my client's assets are safeguarded. We request a swift dissolution and distribution of assets as outlined." Jenna didn't flinch. Instead, she pulled the worn folder closer, tracing the edges with her fingers as she waited. The judge nodded. "Mrs. Thompson, do you have any evidence or arguments to present?" "Yes, Your Honor," she said, rising to her feet. Markham sighed audibly, looking bored already. Jenna opened the folder, revealing a single yellowed page. "I'd like to submit this as evidence." The judge gestured for the bailiff to retrieve it. As the page made its way to the bench, Greg finally looked up, his eyes narrowing. Markham leaned in to whisper something to his client, likely reminding him that nothing could jeopardize his wealth. Jenna could feel their dismissive energy, two men so sure of their dominance. The judge adjusted his glasses and studied the paper, his expression shifting from indifference to curiosity. He cleared his throat. "This is a stock purchase agreement. Can you explain its relevance, Mrs. Thompson?" Jenna hesitated only for a moment. "That document outlines an investment my husband and I made 21 years ago, Your Honor. We purchased shares in a fledgling tech company, one that my husband later dismissed as a financial mistake. At the time, he insisted we cut our losses and transfer his shares to my name to simplify our taxes. I never sold them." Markham scoffed, cutting in. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant. The company likely folded years ago." Jenna's lips curved into a slight smile. "Actually, it didn't. It was later acquired by one of the largest tech giants in the country. The shares have appreciated significantly, worth over $80 million as of this month." The room fell deathly silent. Greg's face paled, and Markham's confident posture shattered in an instant. The judge leaned back, his eyebrows raised in disbelief. "Mrs. Thompson, are you saying you hold the controlling interest in a company worth that amount?" "Yes, Your Honor. And since my husband voluntarily relinquished his shares to me years ago, they belong solely to me." Greg shot to his feet, his face twisted in fury. "You're lying. That company was a disaster." Jenna remained calm, holding his gaze with a newfound strength. "You never bothered to look back, Greg. You were too busy climbing higher and collecting trophies to notice the roots you left behind." "I didn't forget." Greg's face burned red, his hands clenched into fists. For a moment, it seemed like he might lunge across the room. The judge banged his gavel, restoring order, but the whispers in the courtroom were relentless, gossip spreading like wildfire through the spectators. Jenna stayed calm, refusing to let his anger shake her. Greg leaned over to Markham, whispering furiously. The lawyer, now visibly uneasy, rifled through his briefcase, pretending to search for something useful. Jenna almost felt pity for him, almost. But then she remembered all the years Markham had spent making sure Greg's business dealings stayed as ruthless as possible. Sympathy had no place here. The judge finally spoke, his voice sharp and direct. "Mr. Thompson, sit down. Outbursts will not be tolerated. Mrs. Thompson, please elaborate on how this investment was handled and why your husband is unaware of its current value." Jenna nodded, keeping her tone measured. "Your Honor, my husband had little interest in the startup world. He was focused on his own company, building his empire. He insisted that putting the shares in my name would be simpler tax-wise. At the time, he considered it a dead investment, so he dismissed it entirely. I kept the paperwork and, over the years, tracked the company's progress. When it merged with a major tech giant 5 years ago, the value skyrocketed. I never informed him because, well, he never cared to ask." Greg slammed his fist on the table, drawing another warning glance from the judge. "You conniving witch," he spat. "You planned this. You hid it from me." Jenna turned to him, calm and unshaken. "I didn't hide anything, Greg. You handed me those shares without a second thought. I didn't force you to do anything. You were too arrogant to think I might hold on to them, too confident that nothing in my hands could ever be worth anything." Markham cleared his throat, desperate to regain control. "Your Honor, even if what she says is true, there's no proof of the actual value of these shares. We request a formal assessment to determine the validity of her claims." The judge gave Markham a skeptical look. "Mr. Markham, the document she provided clearly shows the acquisition details and the updated value. It's legitimate." For the first time, Markham's polished demeanor cracked, and he fumbled with his notes, unsure how to continue. Greg's eyes darted around the room, desperate for some advantage to cling to. He was used to manipulating people, bending them to his will, but this situation was slipping from his grasp. Jenna almost smiled at his helplessness. Almost. Markham, still determined to salvage the situation, rose to his feet. "Your Honor, even if the investment is substantial, my client is entitled to claim marital rights over those assets. The shares were acquired during the marriage." Jenna's heart pounded, but she remained composed. "That's not entirely accurate," she said, addressing the judge. "The shares were signed over to me as a gift, with Greg's full consent and signature. He relinquished all rights to them at the time, and that decision is legally binding. I did nothing underhanded or deceitful. It's all documented." The judge nodded thoughtfully. "If the assets were indeed transferred as a gift, Mr. Thompson has no legal claim to them. We'll verify the signatures and the timeline, but so far, the evidence supports Mrs. Thompson's account." Greg's face contorted with fury, but his words were caught in his throat. Jenna couldn't help but feel a flicker of triumph. For once, she wasn't the one cowering, begging for his attention or approval. For once, she held the power, and it tasted far sweeter than she had ever imagined. Markham whispered something to Greg, trying to strategize, but Jenna knew there was nothing left to strategize. It was over. She turned to face Greg directly, holding his gaze. "You never thought I'd be strong enough to stand up to you," she said quietly. "You never thought I'd outsmart you. But all your money and arrogance blinded you to the truth. You made me stronger. You thought keeping me small would keep you safe. But look at where we are now." Greg's jaw clenched and his eyes narrowed. "You'll pay for this, Jenna. You think you've won, but I'll make sure you regret ever standing up to me." She met his glare with unwavering resolve. "You've threatened me for years, but I'm not afraid of you anymore. You can't hurt me, because you've already done your worst. Now it's my turn to live." The judge called for a recess, and Jenna finally allowed herself to exhale. As she gathered her things, one of the court clerks approached her with a quiet word of encouragement. It was strange. After years of feeling invisible, people were finally noticing her, seeing her as more than just Greg's discarded wife. As she walked out of the courtroom, Jenna couldn't help but feel a strange mixture of victory and loss. She hadn't wanted to destroy Greg, only to survive him. But now that the truth was out, she felt lighter, as if chains that had held her down for years were finally shattered. The hallway was crowded with reporters, and Jenna kept her head high, refusing to let their questions rattle her. She didn't need anyone's validation or sympathy. She had made it this far on her own, and nothing could take that away. As she stepped out into the cold air, Jenna looked up at the sky, a sense of peace washing over her. The storm was far from over. She knew Greg would fight tooth and nail to claw back some of his wealth. But it didn't matter. Jenna was done playing the victim. She was done being underestimated. And she wasn't going to lose this battle, because for the first time she had something worth fighting for. The courtroom resumed, and Jenna took her seat with newfound confidence. Markham, clearly rattled, had been on the phone during the entire recess, probably trying to find any loophole that could save his client. Greg sat rigid, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table. The man who had once dominated every room he walked into now looked like a caged animal, cornered and desperate. The judge rapped his gavel once more, signaling the continuation of the proceedings. "Mrs. Thompson," he addressed Jenna, "do you have any further evidence or statements to present?" "Yes, Your Honor," Jenna replied, her voice calm but unwavering. She opened the folder once more, taking out a few more documents. "These are statements from our joint bank accounts at the time of the transfer. They prove that the money used to purchase the shares came from my personal savings, not from our joint assets. That means Greg had no legal claim over the initial purchase, let alone the shares themselves." Markham looked like he was about to faint. Greg, however, couldn't contain his rage any longer. "This is insane," he shouted, slamming his hands on the table. "You think you can just take my money and my company without a fight? You're nothing without me, Jenna. You hear me? Nothing." The judge pounded his gavel, silencing him immediately. "Mr. Thompson, another outburst like that and you'll be held in contempt of court. Control yourself." Jenna didn't flinch, though her heart pounded in her chest. Years of emotional abuse had conditioned her to brace for his explosions, but today she wouldn't cower. She looked him dead in the eye and spoke with quiet strength. "You always thought I was too weak to leave you," she said, her voice steady. "But the truth is, I stayed because I loved you, because I believed in the man I thought you were. I was willing to forgive everything. The affairs, the lies, even the way you treated me like I was less than nothing. But not anymore. You didn't just break my heart, you broke me. And I rebuilt myself without you." The courtroom fell silent, captivated by her words. Even the judge seemed moved, his stern expression softening just a fraction. Markham attempted to regain his footing. "Your Honor, with all due respect, Mrs. Thompson's emotional outbursts are irrelevant to the legal matter at hand. We request that the court disregard her statements as they pertain to personal grievances rather than financial evidence. The judge fixed Markham with a piercing stare. Considering the abusive and manipulative nature demonstrated by Mr. Thompson, I find Mrs. Thompson's statements to be pertinent in assessing the full scope of this case. Furthermore, the financial evidence supports her claims. The shares were legally transferred to her as a gift, and her own funds were used in the purchase. Therefore, the court recognizes Mrs. Thompson as the sole owner of the shares and the controlling stakeholder in the merged corporation. Greg slumped back into his seat, his face ashen and defeated. Markham whispered something to him, probably advising him to stay calm, but it was too late. Greg's empire was gone, and Jenna could see the stark realization dawning in his eyes. The judge continued. In light of the findings, the court rules in favor of Mrs. Thompson regarding ownership of the contested assets. As for alimony, given the substantial financial position of Mrs. Thompson as revealed today, the court finds that no further spousal support is required. It hit Greg like a punch to the gut. No money, no power, and no chance to take back what he had lost. Jenna couldn't help the small, triumphant smile that touched her lips. She had done it. She had freed herself from his control, not just financially but emotionally as well. As the gavel struck for the final time, the courtroom buzzed with murmurs, reporters scrambling to update their headlines. Jenna gathered her things, the worn folder tucked safely under her arm, and made her way to the exit. Before she could reach the doors, Greg blocked her path. His eyes were cold, his lips twisted in a sneer. "You think you've won?" he hissed, voice low and venomous. "You'll never be free of me. I'll make your life a living hell. I'll ruin you, Jenna." She met his gaze with an unwavering stare. "You've already done your worst, Greg. You can't break what's already been rebuilt. You'll have to live with the fact that your own arrogance destroyed you. You lost everything because you couldn't see past your own ego. Goodbye, Greg." She brushed past him, never looking back. Outside the courthouse, the crisp air hit her face, and Jenna took a deep breath, finally feeling the weight lift from her shoulders. A group of reporters descended on her, cameras flashing, questions flying from every direction. "How does it feel to have won, Mrs. Thompson?" one of them asked, thrusting a microphone toward her. Jenna paused, considering her words carefully. "It's not about winning or losing," she said softly. "It's about reclaiming your power when someone tries to take it from you. It's about finding strength even when you've been broken. I didn't come here to hurt anyone. I just came to find myself again." With that, she moved past the reporters, walking down the courthouse steps with a sense of freedom she hadn't felt in years. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time it was hers to shape. No more shadows of doubt, no more fear of his wrath. Just the open road ahead and the woman she was becoming. Strong, unbreakable, and undeniably free. Dear viewers, thank you for watching. If you like this story, please subscribe to our channel to receive more stories every day. Share with us what you think of this story and tell us where you're watching from.